I still remember the sound that lamp made, a tiny click, then a faint crackle, almost polite in the way it announced its own death. 1 second, my desk was wrapped in warm yellow light. The next, it was just a hollow square of shadows. And there I sat, in the middle of a busy workday, staring at a dark screen and a dead bulb, wondering why something so small felt like a punch to the chest. You know, I've lived long enough to watch people break down for reasons that had nothing to do with the real reason. A spilled coffee, a missed subway, a message left on red. But that afternoon, sitting there with a lamp that refused to give even a flicker, I realized I had joined their ranks. I didn't get angry. I didn't curse. I just felt empty. That emptiness surprised me. It wasn't about the lamp. It wasn't even about the work I was doing. It was about something deeper, a kind of slow dimming inside me that I hadn't dared to name. And as the office hummed around me, keyboards clacking, phones ringing, people moving at full speed, I felt as if I had been quietly running on a dying bulb for years. Funny how life works. We ignore the loud alarms, but we notice the tiny ones. A burned-out lamp, a sigh we didn't mean to let slip, a moment of silence that lasts a little too long. I sat there in that dim corner, and an odd thought crossed my mind. When did I stop checking my own wiring? The light had gone out in front of me, but the truth was, I hadn't been shining that brightly myself. I'd been pushing through deadlines, glancing past people I cared about, promising myself I'd slow down after things calmed down. And things never did. They rarely do. In that moment of unexpected darkness, something inside me softened. I felt this odd mixture of irritation and relief. Irritation because I didn't have time for this. Relief because some quiet part of me whispered, "Finally, you finally stopped long enough to notice." As I leaned back in my chair, the darkness didn't feel threatening. It felt honest. It showed me what I'd been refusing to see in the light. My own fatigue, tucked into the corners of my life like dust I kept sweeping under the rug. A small question rose up inside me. Where else am I barely glowing? My health? My relationships? The dreams I promised myself I'd chase 10 years ago? My patience? My spark? That lamp wasn't the problem. It was the messenger. And messengers have a way of showing up when we're least prepared and most in need. A few minutes later, a coworker walked by and noticed my shadowed corner. He laughed and said, "Looks like your light finally gave up on us." I smiled back, but inside I was thinking, not just the light. In the weeks that followed, I kept noticing things I would have ignored before. A friend who rushed to say, "I'm fine," even when his eyes looked tired. A woman in a cafe staring into her latte like she was searching for answers in the foam. A teenager on the subway blinking back tears while pretending to scroll. People with lights that flickered. People who felt like I did that day. People holding themselves together in the half-dark. And it made me wonder, how many of us keep living on a dim setting because we're too busy, too proud, or too distracted to notice the truth? How many of us keep walking around promising ourselves that next month, after the project, once things settle, will finally take care of the exhaustion that's been draining us one quiet watt at a time. Life has a gentle way of tapping us on the shoulder. When we ignore the tap, it gives us a nudge. When we ignore the nudge, it flips a breaker. That lamp flipping off was my breaker. And here's the strange thing. Once I admitted how tired I was, something inside me lifted. Not all at once, not in some cinematic rush, but slowly, like the dimmer turning up for the first time in a long while. That moment of darkness became the beginning of something I hadn't felt in years. Honest self-respect. Not the kind based on achievements or approval. The kind that says, I'm worth taking care of. My life deserves more than survival mode. I don't have to earn rest by breaking first. I've come to believe that growth rarely starts with triumph. It starts with truth. And truth often slips in disguised as something small. A quiet room, a broken lamp, a breath you didn't realize you were holding. You'd be amazed what a little darkness can reveal. And that day, in the dim glow of a computer screen, I quietly asked myself a question I hadn't asked since I was young enough to dream without permission. What do I want my life to feel like? Not look like, not appear like, but feel like. The funny thing is, once you ask a question like that, you can't unhear the answer, even if it whispers at first. And mine whispered something simple. I want to feel awake again. What happened next, and the people I met in the weeks that followed, only deepened that realization. Because once you tune your ears to the small signals in your life, you start hearing them everywhere. In your colleagues, in strangers, in people you love, and most importantly, in yourself. And every signal, no matter how faint, is asking the same thing. Are you willing to see what's really happening? Are you willing to adjust the parts of your life that have been dim for too long? Are you willing to start living with the lights fully on? I didn't know it then, but that broken lamp had gently nudged open the door to a new chapter. A chapter where I would finally stop pretending that running on fumes was a normal way to live. And that's where this story truly begins. I didn't expect the days after that moment to feel any different, but they did. Not dramatically, not in some inspiring movie montage, more like the slow brightening of morning light leaking through the blinds, gentle, patient, honest. I started noticing the quiet things, the little signals I used to brush off as background noise. A long sigh I didn't mean to let out. The way my shoulders stayed tense even when I wasn't stressed. The subtle relief I felt when plans got canceled. These tiny moments weren't inconveniences anymore. They were invitations. Life whispers before it shouts. One evening I walked into a small coffee shop near the office. I'd been there dozens of times, but that day felt different. The barista behind the counter was a young woman who usually kept the place humming with her energy. But that night her hands were flat on the counter, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. When she finally looked up, she tried to give me her usual bright smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You okay?" someone behind her asked. "Yeah," she said. "Just tired." But it wasn't the tired of a long shift. It was the tired of carrying too much for too long.
I recognized it instantly because I'd seen that same expression in the mirror earlier that week.
It was the look of someone whose light had been dim for so long they'd forgotten what brightness feels like. And standing there, waiting for a cup of coffee I didn't really need, I felt that familiar truth again. People rarely fall apart because of big things. They fall apart because the small ones never stop accumulating. Later that week, I was riding the subway home when I noticed a man in a suit, maybe in his 40s, holding a laptop bag on his knees. The train rattled on its tracks, lights flickering overhead, and he kept staring at the window. But he wasn't looking outside. He was looking at his reflection, studying his own face the way someone studies a map when they've finally admitted they're lost. He didn't look angry. He didn't look sad. He looked unlit, like nobody had asked him in a long time how he was really doing. And worse, like he hadn't asked himself either. And I thought about the strange honesty of burned-out bulbs. When the light goes out, you suddenly see everything you were ignoring. It made me ask myself questions I'd avoided for years. Where in my life was I only pretending to shine? Which parts of me were quietly humming along without any real energy behind them? Where was I settling for fine when I desperately needed alive? It wasn't easy to face those questions, but it was freeing. Because there is a moment, delicate, quiet, unmistakable, when exhaustion turns into truth. And truth, even when it hurts, always clears a path. A few nights later, I was sitting on my couch, laptop open, emails piling up, when I heard rain tapping softly against the windows. For the first time in months, I closed the laptop before I finished all my tasks. I didn't make an excuse. I didn't promise myself I'd catch up later. I just closed it. I sat there in the dim room, listening to the rain, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Presence. A kind of stillness that wasn't empty, but grounding. Like the world was saying, "Stay here for a minute. It's okay." And it was okay. That night I realized something gentle but powerful. Maturity isn't the moment you become stronger. It's the moment you become willing to tell yourself the truth. And the truth was simple. I was tired. I'd been tired for a long time. And it was time to stop pretending otherwise. Once you admit that, a strange thing happens. Your inner voice, the one you keep silencing with productivity and politeness, begins to speak again. Softly at first, then with more courage. It asks questions you forgot to ask. It points to dreams you shelved because they weren't practical. It reminds you of people you miss, habits you need, hopes you buried, goals you postponed. It shines its own small flashlight into the corners of your life. And you finally see what's been waiting there for you. Untouched, unspoken, unfinished. I once believed that clarity came with bright lights and sudden revelations. But now I think it comes when the lights go out, and you can no longer distract yourself with shine. Clarity grows in the quiet. It grows in the pause. It grows when you're finally willing to sit with yourself without rushing to the next thing. As that realization settled in me, something inside shifted. Just a little, like a door opening a crack. And through that crack came the first warm breath of possibility. Because once you admit what needs attention, you can finally begin to heal it.
Once you see what's dim, you can choose to brighten it. And once you allow yourself to be honest, the world around you becomes honest too.
In the weeks that followed, I found myself drawn to moments I used to overlook. Not the big moments, not the promotions, not the deadlines, not the victories, but the quiet ones. The ones that pass unnoticed unless you're really paying attention. Because once your eyes adjust to the dim, you start seeing truth hiding in subtle places. One afternoon, I was in the lobby waiting for an elevator. People shuffled in and out, scrolling on their phones, tapping messages with that strange urgency only modern life seems to create. As the doors slid open, I stepped inside with a woman I'd seen around the building. Always polished, always composed. The kind of confident stride that makes you think she's never known a moment of doubt. But that day she stood in the corner, arms crossed tightly, breathing in short, controlled bursts. I asked if she was all right. She hesitated, like she was weighing whether honesty was worth the vulnerability. Finally, she whispered, "I think I'm running on fumes." The elevator hummed. The world outside kept spinning. But in that little metal box, the truth felt so raw and so real that it grounded us both. Running on fumes. How many of us build our lives around that very idea? Pushing, pushing, pushing. Not because we are strong, but because stopping feels harder than continuing. As we reached her floor, she managed a half smile and said, "I don't know how long I can keep going like this." The doors closed behind her, and I stood there in the quiet, thinking about how many people are silently collapsing under the weight of expectations they never chose. Expectations handed to them by culture, by family, by ambition, by fear. And then I thought about my lamp. That tiny bulb had done something profound. It made me stop. It made me finally look at the parts of my life where I had been quietly dimming. And the more honest I became with myself, the more I saw others trying to do the same. A friend of mine, the kind who always seemed unshakable, steady voice, certainty worn like a tailored suit, confessed to me one evening that he hadn't slept well in months. Not just because of stress, but because he felt like he was living a life he couldn't fully recognize. "I keep waiting for the motivation to come back," he said, "but it doesn't. Just the exhaustion." He wasn't alone in that feeling. I'd heard echoes of it everywhere, from colleagues, from baristas, from strangers on trains, from people who looked fine on the outside but were quietly unraveling inside. It made me realize something I had been avoiding. Your life doesn't fall apart all at once. It frays at the edges. A thread here, a loose stitch there, a moment of doubt you ignore, a drop in energy you explain away, a dream you push aside just for now. And then one day, a lamp goes out, and suddenly you're staring at the darkness, realizing how long you've been pretending it was still bright. That's when the truth steps in. Quietly, gently, but unmistakably. One night after a long day, I turned off all the lights and sat by the window, watching the city glow beneath me. Cars passed like tiny comets. Apartment windows flickered with lives unfolding behind them. Dinners, arguments, laughter, loneliness, hope. I wondered how many people behind those windows were sitting in their own quiet darkness, trying to make sense of their lives. How many were avoiding a truth that scared them,
How many were waiting for permission to stop pretending? And then I realized something soft and liberating. Nobody needs permission to come back to themselves. Nobody needs a crisis to justify rest. Nobody needs a burned-out lamp to start paying attention. What we need is honesty, the kind that doesn't judge or shame but simply observes. The kind that says, "You're tired, and that's okay."
The kind that says, "It's time to take your life seriously." Not the external parts, but the internal ones. I leaned back in my chair and whispered to myself something I had never dared to say before. I want a life that feels like mine. Not one that impresses anyone, not one that checks the right boxes, not one that earns applause. A life that feels lived. And the moment you say that out loud, even quietly, the world inside you shifts. Something begins to stir. Something begins to breathe again. Because naming what you feel is the beginning of transformation. It's the spark before the flame. It's the moment the dimness starts to brighten, even if only slightly. That night, in the soft glow of the city lights, I felt something warm inside me. Something I had missed. Something I thought I'd lost. A sense of possibility. And I knew then, gently, firmly, with a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years, that the path forward wouldn't be complicated. It wouldn't require reinvention or grand gestures. It would require noticing. It would require truth. It would require small steps toward a life that didn't just function, but glowed. Because the beginning of maturity, the real kind, the kind that changes you, is the moment you stop saying, "I'm fine," and start saying, "I'm willing to see what's really going on." And that's when the light begins to return. As the days unfolded, I realized that noticing the dim places in my life was only the beginning. Awareness without action can turn into another form of exhaustion, the kind where you know what's wrong, but feel too overwhelmed to do anything about it. So I made myself slow down. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, steady ways that felt human. I stopped pretending that exhaustion was a normal lifestyle. I stopped treating rest like a luxury. I stopped waiting for some imaginary right moment to begin taking myself seriously. And as I softened into this new approach, something unexpected began to happen. I started reconnecting with parts of myself I thought were gone forever. One evening, I found an old notebook buried at the back of my closet. The pages were filled with ideas I'd written years ago. Dreams I promised myself I'd chase when things settled down. Looking through it, I felt a surprising ache in my chest. Not sadness, not regret, more like recognition. I had dimmed those dreams so quietly that I didn't even notice when the last of their light flickered out. But now, sitting with that notebook, I felt a small glow return. Not bright, not overwhelming, just enough to remind me that I once had hopes that didn't revolve around deadlines or obligations. Hopes that belonged to the warmest part of me. The part that wasn't exhausted or performing or pretending. And as I sat there with those memories, I realized something soft but essential. The parts of us that go dim don't disappear. They wait. They wait for honesty. They wait for space They wait for light. I carried that thought with me the next morning as I walked into the office. The building buzzed with its usual energy. People balancing coffees, answering emails before their coats were off, rushing as if the world demanded urgency from every breath. But something felt different to me. For the first time, I wasn't rushing with them. I was simply moving, present enough to feel the ground under my feet. And in that slower rhythm, I noticed something I had never really seen in this place before. A colleague sitting at her desk, eyes closed, breathing slowly. A man from finance rubbing his temples like he was trying to press the stress out of his skull. A receptionist pausing between phone calls, her shoulders rising and falling in a sigh she didn't think anyone heard. The whole office, maybe the whole city, was full of people running on low batteries. And it made me want to do something I'd never done before. Acknowledge it. Not fix it, not solve it, just acknowledge it. That afternoon, I asked the young analyst, the one whose voice had trembled weeks earlier, if he wanted to grab a coffee. We walked to a quiet corner cafe and sat by the window. He talked about work, expectations, the pressure to be the reliable one, the one who always had it together. At one point, he said, "I feel like I'm carrying more than my age should allow." And I understood that feeling with painful clarity. I told him something simple, something true. It's okay to put things down. He didn't respond right away. He just looked out the window, watching people hurry by, each one wrapped in their own invisible battles. After a long moment, he nodded. "I don't even know where to start," he said. I smiled gently. "Nobody ever does," I said. "You just start with what hurts the most." He laughed, a short, tired laugh. But in his eyes I saw something I recognized from my own reflections. A spark. Small, yes, faint, but real. That's the thing about honesty. It doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. It just needs space. Later that night, I sat in my apartment with the lights off, letting the silence settle around me. This time, the darkness didn't feel like an interruption. It felt like a companion, a witness, a gentle reminder that not every part of life needs to be illuminated at once. Some parts are meant to be discovered slowly, patiently, as we grow brave enough to face them. And as I thought back on everything, the burned-out lamp, the tired co-workers, the strangers on the subway, the truths I finally allowed myself to feel, I knew something with peaceful certainty. The turning point in life rarely arrives with fanfare. It arrives in the quietest moment, when we finally admit what we've been avoiding. Honesty is the doorway. Gentleness is the key. And intention, quiet, steady intention, is the first step toward living with the lights fully on. I took a long breath and let it settle inside me. I felt my own light stirring, still soft, still small, but growing in a way that felt true. And for the first time in a long while, I felt deeply, sincerely alive. In the days that followed, I found myself returning again and again to the same quiet truth. Renewal doesn't arrive like a thunderstorm. It arrives like dawn. First a dim glow, then a soft shift in the air. Only later do you realize the world around you has changed. And in that gentle unfolding, I started taking real steps toward brightening the dim places of my life. Not dramatic steps, not sweeping declarations, just honest ones. I began ending my workdays on time. Not always, but often enough that I felt a difference. I started walking home instead of rushing for the nearest train. I let myself sit in silence without reaching for a screen. I reached out to people I had drifted from, not out of guilt, but out of longing. I let myself acknowledge what I missed, what I wanted, and what I deserved. And with every small step, my inner light grew a little stronger. One evening, as I cleaned out my desk drawer, I found the burned-out bulb from that lamp. For some reason, I had thrown it in there instead of tossing it away. Maybe some part of me knew I wasn't finished with it yet. I held it in my hand, turning it over gently. It wasn't just glass and metal anymore. It had become a symbol, a quiet artifact from the moment my life shifted. A reminder that even the smallest failure can become a beginning if you let it. I placed it on the corner of my desk, not as a warning, but as a witness. And each day, seeing that bulb reminded me to check in with myself, to ask the questions I used to avoid, to notice the parts of me that were glowing and the parts that were dimming, to pause before pushing myself past my own humanity. Because I've come to believe something wholeheartedly. The true beginning of adulthood is not when we assume responsibility. It's when we learn how to face ourselves honestly. Maybe maturity isn't about becoming tougher or wiser or more efficient. Maybe maturity is the simple courage to say, I am not okay, and let that truth guide you toward the light you've been missing. And somewhere in that honesty, life softens. The world slows. Your heart unclenches. And you begin to rebuild. Not the life you were pressured to create, but the life that feels like yours. In this new chapter, I found room to breathe again. Room to feel again. Room to forgive myself for all the years I spent pretending to shine when I was flickering inside. One quiet morning, as sunlight slipped across my desk, I reached for a new bulb and replaced the burned-out one. When I flipped the switch, warm light filled the room, brighter than before. Or maybe I was just finally present enough to notice. And standing there in that gentle glow, I understood something with peaceful certainty. A burned-out lamp didn't break me. It woke me. It showed me the power of small pauses and honest questions. It reminded me that life doesn't get better when we push harder. It gets better when we see ourselves clearly. And in that clarity, something beautiful begins. A different kind of ambition, a more humane kind of strength, a deeper kind of peace. I don't know where your life feels dim right now. Maybe in your work, or your relationships, or in the hopes you keep postponing for a quieter day. But I've learned that every flicker, every sigh, every quiet heaviness is a message from the deepest part of you. A part that still believes in your brightness. A part that refuses to give up on you. A part that knows you are meant to glow. So when the next small thing goes wrong, when your phone freezes or your plans fall apart, or some tiny detail interrupts your day, pause. Not with frustration, but with curiosity. Ask yourself gently, what in me is asking for attention? What part of my life is ready to be renewed? What truth have I been too busy to feel? Because renewal doesn't come from force, it comes from willingness. The willingness to listen, the willingness to stop pretending, the willingness to begin again. And once you begin, the world around you seems to rearrange itself, not magically, but meaningfully, not instantly, but steadily, not perfectly, but honestly. And honesty is where the glow begins. As I sit here now, looking at the lamp casting warm light across the room, I feel something I hadn't felt in years. Not excitement, not triumph. Peace. A quiet, steady peace. The kind that tells you you're finally living your life from the inside out. The kind that tells you you're no longer pretending to shine, you're actually shining. The kind that tells you the dimming days are behind you, and the days ahead will be brighter than you imagined. And that's what I want to leave you with. A reminder, a whisper, a gentle truth. Tomorrow may never come, but today is here, waiting for you to live it.